The station was called Veth Mora on the old survey charts, a waypoint depot from before the war, pressurized but dead, adrift in the gravity well of a gas giant that nobody had gotten around to naming. It had been a food cache point once, for long-haul prospectors running the outer belt routes. By the time I got there, it was a ruin with breathable air and 43 hours of emergency heat, still cycling through the hull, maybe less. The emergency heat was the kind that goes on after everything else has already failed. I had been there 14 hours before I found him. My scout cutter had taken a rail round through the starboard thruster bay during the skirmish near the relay buoy, 3 hours out from the station. I had limped Veth Mora on main chemical thrust and locked it to the exterior dock while the cutter cooled, then gone aboard looking for a repair kit I could cannibalize. Instead, I found 3 of my own crew dead in the forward lock. They'd taken the depot during the opening minutes of the engagement, I found out weeks later. And then, I found him in what had been the station's mess compartment, on the floor with his back to a locker bank and a piece of his own armor plating pressed flat against the wound in his side. He was Veth Sarathi. That was the designation we used in the service, though I don't think they called themselves anything so compact. They were the species the war was actually about, territorial, cold logic, resource calculative, in a way that looked like cruelty from the outside, and probably looked like mathematics from the inside. Absolutely convinced that humanity was an organism problem rather than a civilization problem. We had made first contact with them 11 years before. We had been fighting them for 7. I had never been closer to one than a targeting reticle. He looked at me. I looked at him. The piece of armor plating was doing nothing useful. I could see the wound from the hatchway. A plasma edge burn, lower left quadrant, through the layered chitin that served them as a ribcage equivalent. The chitin had cracked and curled back at the burn edges, and the tissue beneath was dark and exposed. It was the kind of wound that kills slowly, over hours, through fluid loss and secondary damage, if it isn't closed. He knew it. I could tell he knew it by the way he held the plate. Not desperately, not with the tight grip of someone fighting panic, but precisely, the way a technician holds something in place while waiting for the correct tool to arrive. He did not move toward a weapon, neither did I. We were past that in maybe 4 seconds, though I cannot fully explain why. I think we both understood, without exchanging anything deliberate, that the arithmetic had changed. His side was gone. I could see a second Veth Sarathi body in the far end of the compartment, still in armor. My ship was grounded. The nearest friendly hull for either of us was somewhere beyond the gas giant, unreachable, until someone ran a search pattern, and that would be his people or mine, and there was no way to know which would arrive first, or what they would do when they did. I crossed the compartment and crouched beside him. My kit was back in the cutter. I went and got it, and when I came back he was in the same position, which told me something about his disposition that I filed away. I had a standard field kit, 1 field dressing, 2 cautery strips, a suture tool with 3 interchangeable heads. None of it was designed for Veth Sarathi anatomy. The field dressing would not adhere to chitin. The cautery strips might work. That was a guess. The suture heads would not engage the chitin edges. I could see that just by looking. I thought about it for about 90 seconds, turning the options over in a methodical way. Then I unlaced my left boot. The bootlace was 1.4 meters of braided composite fiber cord, standard quartermaster issue from Reach Station, replaced by me the previous month, because the original had frayed at the aglet. It was the right diameter, narrower than suture line but strong enough. It would not dissolve in whatever fluids the wound was producing. It was what I had. I do not know if he understood what I was doing when I began. He went very still, not the stillness of someone bracing against expected pain. I learned to read that difference over the 3 days that followed, but the stillness of something encountering a behavior it cannot yet categorize. The Veth Sarathi were recorders by temperament, or so the intelligence files said. Everything they encountered was filed, compared, indexed against existing patterns. They did not leave gaps in their records if they could help it. What I was doing did not fit any existing pattern he had. He let me work. I cleaned the wound with the antiseptic from the kit. Again, a guess, but an educated one. I used both cautery strips on the deepest tissue layer I could reach without proper instruments, closing off the bleed points that were doing the most damage. That part he reacted to. A short, low sound and a tightening of the muscles in his arm, but he held still. Then I pulled the chitin edges together with my fingers, which required more force than I expected. The cracked sections were stiff and resistant, like trying to close the halves of a hard-shell casing that had warped in heat. I held them in contact and laced the bootlace through the natural notch points along the wound edge, stress relief grooves in the chitin structure, almost like they were designed for it, drawing the sides together with each pass. 6 passes total, 3 on each side of center. I knotted at both ends with the field tension knot they'd taught us in basic, the one that holds under vibration and repeated stress. He made one sound during the final tying off. It was low and very brief, and I did not know what it meant. I kept working until it was done. When I sat back on my heels and looked at it, it held. I knew it would hold. Not permanently, not by any definition a field surgeon would accept, but long enough for what we needed. He looked at it too. He moved his head to examine it from 2 angles, and then he set the armor plate down beside him and did not pick it up again. For the next 3 days, we occupied that station together. We did not speak. I had 4 words of Veth Sarathi, all tactical, none useful. We divided the mess compartment by unspoken agreement. I rationed what I'd brought from the cutter. At some point on the 2nd day, he produced something from a sealed pouch on his armor and ate it without looking at me, and I ate my own ration block without looking at him. I checked the wound twice a day. He moved the damaged chitin section aside when I came to look, and replaced it when I stepped back. On the 2nd day, the tissue around the bootlace had swollen, and by evening had not worsened, which was all I could interpret without a scanner. On the 3rd day he stood up without difficulty, and walked to the viewport, and watched the gas giant's cloud bands roll through their long, slow cycles. I found myself watching them too, from my side of the compartment. The Veth Sarathi rescue tender found the station on the 41st hour. I knew it was Veth Sarathi before it docked because the hull geometry was distinct on the station's one functioning proximity sensor, and I sat down on the floor with my back to the locker bank, in the same position he'd been in when I first found him, and I waited. He could have said anything to the officer who came aboard. He could have said nothing and left my situation to be resolved by military protocol, which would not have resolved it in my favor. Instead, he came to the hatchway of the mess compartment and spoke. I did not understand a word of it. The exchange lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then the officer looked at me once, looked back at him, and withdrew. They brought me out on the tender. No restraints. I was transferred to a neutral jurisdiction platform above the gas giant, the kind that exists on paper between powers who are at war everywhere else, and from there to my own side in under a week. The debrief took 4 hours. Near the end, the interviewer asked me what he had said to the officer, the 40 seconds of Veth Sarathi, that had apparently cleared my transit. I told her I didn't know. That was true. What I had, when I reached my bunk on the transit ship and unlaced my remaining boot, was the absence. 1 boot laced, 1 boot not. I have thought about those 40 seconds for years. The Veth Sarathi were recorders. Everything filed, compared, indexed. He had a category for enemy combatant. He had a protocol for prisoner. What he apparently did not have, before that mess compartment, was a category for a man who crossed a room he didn't have to cross, went back for his kit, and then spent 90 seconds looking at a bootlace. Whatever he told that officer, I walked out of a war zone with 1 boot laced. I replaced the lace when I got home. Standard issue from the quartermaster. I've replaced it twice more since then. I never found out if he survived. The wound was serious, and my closure was imperfect, and the war ran another 4 years before the armistice. I looked, later, when prisoner and casualty records were exchanged across the ceasefire lines. I did not find his designation, which might mean anything. I hope the files came out right.